If you want to understand someone who really changed the course of history, you first got to understand the world they were born into. So that's what we're going to do. We're heading back to the 6th century to set the stage for the Prophet Muhammad. To really wrap our heads around all this, we're going to tackle one big question. And this one comes straight from our source material. How can we really describe the world Muhammad was born into? And believe me, the answer takes us everywhere, from massive empires at war to dusty desert trade routes and, the fierce loyalties of the tribes. For centuries, there was really only one name that mattered on the map: Rome. I mean, this empire was huge. It stretched all the way across Europe, North Africa, and deep into the Middle East. It was this colossal, unstoppable force, and if you were living back then, you'd probably think it was going to be around forever. But they were wrong. That idea of permanence, totally an illusion. Turns out the empire's biggest strength, its massive size, ended up being its fatal flaw. It just got too big, too unwieldy to be run by one government. And, well, you know what happens next. The cracks started to appear, and eventually, the whole thing split right in two. Now, the western half, that part collapsed. It kind of crumbled into what we now call medieval Europe. But the eastern half? Whoa, that's a different story. It didn't just survive, it thrived. Seriously, for another 1,000 years, it kept the legacy of Rome alive as the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so you've got the Byzantines, but they weren't the only big player on the block. Oh no. To their east, you had a rival that was just as old and powerful as Rome had been, the Persian Empire. You might also see it called the Sasanian Empire. And that old rivalry with Rome, it didn't just disappear. The Byzantines basically inherited it, and boom, you've got the stage set for a new superpower showdown. All right, so let's break it down. You've got the Byzantine Empire in the west, kind of carrying the torch for old Rome. And then you've got the super powerful Persian Empire over in the east. And these two, they were locked in this endless fight for land, for power, and, this is the big one, for control over the trade routes that connected their worlds. We're talking serious money here. The Byzantines really saw themselves as the true heirs to Roman glory, and they had the economic muscle to back it up. Their power was symbolized by their currency, like this solid gold coin. This wasn't just money, it was a statement. This was the dollar of its day, the currency of the major Western power. And on the other side, check this out, a silver coin from the Persian Empire. It's a perfect visual, right? It shows you the other great power in the neighborhood. So you have two empires, two totally different cultures, two different currencies, and both of them are fighting to be number one. Okay, now let's zoom in on the map. Look at what's stuck right in the middle of these two warring giants. It's the Arabian Peninsula. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place. It was a super important piece of real estate, but also a really dangerous place to live. So being stuck in the middle like that, it had a couple of huge effects on Arabia. On the one hand, it was awesome for business. Arabia became this major hub for trade. Caravans loaded with silk and spices were constantly passing through, making the local merchants incredibly rich. But on the other hand, it turned them into pawns in this giant chess game between the empires. The Byzantines and the Persians would just arm and pay different Arabian tribes to fight each other. Classic proxy war, right? But here's the twist. Because of all that fighting, neither empire could ever really take full control. And that created this kind of power vacuum, which, as you'll see, left the door open for someone else to rise. So you might be wondering, how on earth did anyone even survive out there in that brutal desert, let alone run a whole global trade network? Well, the answer, for the most part, comes down to one amazing animal: the camel. Seriously, the camel was like the ultimate piece of desert tech. It could go for days without water, carrying these massive loads. And there was this one key invention, the North Arabian saddle, that was an absolute game changer. It basically turned the camel into the ancient world's version of a cargo truck and an all-terrain military vehicle, all rolled into one. Super important. And here's a little fun fact for you, right from the sources. Camels had a pretty unique way of defending themselves. They'd spit this gross mix of half-digested gunk from their stomach and saliva at you. Yeah, a pretty effective way to tell someone to back off, I'd say. Okay, so we've talked about the big empires and the trade routes. But what was life actually like for the people living in Arabia? How was their society set up? Well, it was totally different from their big imperial neighbors. First off, the whole area was a real crossroads of different beliefs. Because of all those trade routes, monotheism, the belief in one god, was already a big deal. You had communities of Christians and Jews who had settled all over Arabia. But right alongside them, you had the local Arabian tribes, and a lot of them were polytheistic. That means they believed in many different gods and goddesses, who were often connected to certain places or even things, like rocks or trees. And here's the really crucial part. There was no central government, no king, no president. Your whole identity, your safety, everything, it was all tied to your family, your clan, and your tribe. Loyalty was everything. Sure, clans within the same tribe might fight among themselves, but the second an outsider showed up, they'd unite in a heartbeat. Your fate was your tribe's fate, plain and simple. Now, in this world of tribes, a few towns became super important hubs of power and influence. And there was none more important than a place in Western Arabia called Mecca. And we've got to remember just how tough the climate was out there. Life was a constant struggle for survival. For most people, that meant being a nomad, always on the move, searching for water and food for their animals. But Mecca was different. It was like a magnet, and for two big reasons. First, it had a reliable well. That might not sound like much, but a good water source meant people could finally stop wandering and actually settle down. And second, it was home to a really famous shrine called the Kaaba, which was a sacred center of worship for all those polytheistic tribes in the area. The tribe that was in charge of Mecca and took care of the Kaaba was called the Quraysh, and being the caretakers of this holy site gave them huge religious respect. They were smart, too. They leveraged that respect into serious economic power, and they became some of the most powerful and influential traders in the entire region. And so, it was right here, in this bustling town, sitting at the crossroads of empires, trade, and belief, that a boy was born into this very powerful Quraysh tribe, and his name was Muhammad. So now we've painted the picture, right? We see this incredibly complex world he was born into. And that just leaves us with one last, massive question to think about. How could one person, born right here at the intersection of empires, trade, and tribes, possibly go on to change everything forever?